All right, everyone, thank you for joining me. Thanks for coming out to Left Bank Books. I know it's there's free ice cream to be had, but with the people who prefer literature over the 30 flavors. Thank you for coming out and supporting the local bookstore. Supporting local helps keep our streets paved, our libraries free, our parks open. I won't take long. I know we want to hear the authors. Tyriek White is a writer, musician, and educator from Brooklyn, where he served at-risk and marginalized youth, artists, and scholars in the classroom. He's currently the media director of Lamp Black Lit, a literary foundation which seeks to provide mutual aid and various resources to Black writers across the diaspora. He has received fellowships from Hallelujah Writing Workshop, New York State Writers Institute, and Key West Writers Workshop, among other honors. He holds a degree in creative writing and Africana studies from Hitzer College, and most recently earned an MFA from the University of Mississippi. We Are a Haunting is his first novel. Jaqui Germain is a poet, journalist, and former labor and student organizer living and working here in St. Louis. She's the author of the chapbook When the Ghosts Come Ashore, and her poems have been published in the Rumpus, Tinderbox Poetry Journal, Offing, Muzzle Magazine, Anomaly, as well as anthologies like Bettering American Poetry. Please help me welcome Tyriek White and Jaqui Germain.
Thank you. Oh yeah, you're right. I really not.
That's wrong here. Yeah.
It's chill right here. Okay, yeah. Thanks for coming, everyone. I appreciate Left Bank for holding space for me and inviting me. Thank you again, Jaqui, for joining us. I know this is going to be a great conversation. I'm excited. But yeah, I just wanted to read like a brief excerpt, just to kind of get us into the vibe. It's a quick summary. This is a book about a mother and a son, and son loses his mom, and it's mainly a conversation across time between these two perspectives. And then I also introduce kind of the third, the ancestor, which is the grandmother, Audrey, and this excerpt will be from her perspective. So, yeah, bear with me. Rent control, Joyce explained, from behind the smoke of a cigarette. Her blood was hot and streaked her butterscotch skin, even in the winter. Despite the wrinkles around her eyes, she still looked like a little girl with two missing teeth and ponytail braids. I'd give anything to know or to hear you say that back in Warren County. They sat at the kitchen table of Joyce's apartment on the 11th floor, hollering over running water and sirens below. The windows were wide open because she was cooking at least 3 pounds of pork shoulder for a baby shower. She catered. Joyce and her son would show up with a dozen aluminum pans, wire chafers, and some sterno cans. She even made coquito in the winter and sold it around the neighborhood. What poor Spanish woman did you scam out her recipe? Audrey would tease. Joyce got up and moved to the stove. Joyce had worn her sureness in her shoulders since she was young, ambling through the world with an ease that may have just been pure luck. Even though Audrey had looked after her when they were girls, she had always felt Joyce didn't need much of anyone. Audrey had always been jealous of that. She herself, an awkward thing, tumbling through life, bumping its edges like finding your way through a dark room. It was like everyone else had the lights on. So where do you go after 40 years? Audrey asked no one. Her sister put the top back on some collars. Maybe we should put you in a home. If you don't quit, said Audrey. You know I'll put you up, Joyce said through a grin. It'll be like when we used to sleep in the cellar during them hurricane warnings. And Mama would let us eat all the sweets we could bring down there. They laughed. Audrey leaned back before rubbing her knees. Joyce checked the oven once more. You don't owe nobody anything, Joyce was saying. and you don't owe nobody. If you were to up and leave, no one would complain. And it was simple enough. She could just up and leave. It was so simple. It seemed foolish not to. But people mistake being poor for complacency. Audrey knew she couldn't afford to stay. Even so, she could raise the money. She could go to her church, and pastor was happy raising impromptu offerings for members in need. They could have a fish fry, a raffle, Audrey thought, invite the whole neighborhood. She imagined Joyce with some obscene amount of whiting, hands caked in flour and seasoning, Key with her kids hanging at her hip, with served folks who wander by from the smell, the line snaking halfway down the block. When Audrey thought about it, her face grew hot with tears. If she did raise the money from other poor people, she wouldn't give it to some landlord. She had worked all her life in Brooklyn and deserved not to be kicked out of her own city, deserved not to be taken advantage of for the rest of her life. Normal people didn't have to transcend their surroundings. Maybe something else was wrong, and there was a reason women like her found themselves in courtrooms, in shelters, or on streets, or dead. Why should she have to transcend a goddamn thing? Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful. Just a taste. If anyone's unsure about buying, that should convince you to buy it. The writing in it is really incredible. The language in it is really, really beautiful. We will definitely talk about that. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is the New Yorkness of the book, right? It's obviously based in New York City, in East New York City. But I mean, we'll definitely talk more about the research and the archival work that went into all of the bits and pieces. But I'd love if you could talk about why that setting specifically, like why specifically that part of New York City. I think New York City is one of the places where, like, I think a lot of people think they already know about New York City because they've seen it in pop culture and all these sorts of things, right? But this is a very specific racialized, classed narrative of New York City that I bet people who live in New York City probably also haven't seen. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about why you chose that setting.
Well, mainly, this is the neighborhood I grew up in, East New York, Brooklyn. It's a very particular kind of place. It's on the outskirts of Brooklyn. And I was interested in writing about a place a place from the outskirts overlooking or looking out into empire, right? So, kind of thinking about this place, like working class, blue collar, black and brown folk. They normally don't, I don't know, I haven't read many, stories, contemporary or historically about, that kind of community, the community I come from. So I was really interested in talking solely to, people from my neighborhood, from my block. And that might be a bit selfish, but I was, I felt like, our narratives kind of point to sort of the structural kind of indifferences that empire shows towards us in a sense. So like even explaining kind of how, the rent offices turn us down when we want to apply for a new apartment, or how our teachers are mainly white, how, sort of these like daily kind of moments that we spend sort of navigating the world, right? And it shows and it breaks down into like how, I guess the sickness of kind of the society we live in. And like, I feel like you can see that clearest from the outskirts, from the edge, from the peripheral, right? These disenfranchised communities. So my neighborhood is so kind of particular, you get the I guess the stereotypical kind of like, tenements and warehouses, fields of kind of factories and all of this. But I felt it was important to kind of upend all that. So I approached it with a very like southern kind of lens. So thinking about the landscape, thinking about the land, thinking about the marshlands. This land is on like swamp. This land is on landfill, right? The mob used to dump bodies in certain places in this community, you know. So thinking about it in this kind of natural light, I think kind of upends people's like kind of notions of, oh, this is just like another New York story. And then the outer barrels, you know, like we always get New York from like Central Park to like downtown or whatever. You don't get a lot of the Brooklyn story. You don't get a lot of, you know, Queens, the Bronx, the literal working people who funnel into the city every day to make that machine or that cog kind of work. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to focus on my folk in my community.
That absolutely makes sense, and I do not think that that is selfish at all, right? Like, I think that specificity is really comes through immediately, and I think is really important. I think that's part of the reason why the story works so well. And I think for a lot of this, our favorite stories are the ones that are deeply specific, right? I mean, I think the really interesting thing that I would love to kind of pick up on too is this idea of kind of a southern, like landscape heavy way of talking about the surroundings and the environment, which is like truly not anything that you envision when you picture New York City, right? Like, you don't think of the land or its histories in the way that I think rural spaces get that kind of attention. And I think even when you're talking about kind of the particular kind of blue collar working class community that you're talking about, I think even when you're looking at the literary canon, you see that in rural spaces, like pre-50s literature, right? But you don't see as many contemporary versions of that same class experience. Like, I think that was the thing that was incredibly striking to me about the book, was that it was incredibly contemporary, right? And we don't hear as many kind of blue collar working class narratives. I think we're starting to see them a little bit in like TV, right? Depending on who's in the writers' room. But for the most part, I feel like this felt like a kind of intervention into that space as well in terms of narratives. I'd love, again, because you're talking about a community that you know so well, what were some of the features, the characteristics that you knew like that you needed to get right? Like, what were the things you're like, oh, this is the thing that like other people will recognize who are from this place too?
It's such a good question. I guess, and there's so many. I think on two levels, right? The folklore of it, right? So a lot of it is based in like kind of the supernatural and the surreal, but even on like on a block by block basis, like getting our folklore is correct, right? Like, I know for me growing up, you know, we idolized kind of our OGs, like, you know, the like my older brother and like his friends, and like just thinking about kind of the legend we kind of create around those people, around our neighborhoods, around our blocks. I thought that was like, you know, and no one really taps into that. So, you know, even like having my homies come up to me and like, yo, like I see this entire thing. I see the basketball court. I see the corner store. I see, you know, like having kind of the materiality of I guess the space, and also like the stories we tell about ourselves. I thought that was major. And then yeah, on that second level was kind of that geography, that I guess getting not just the stories right and the space right, but something a bit more like intrinsic. I guess I want to say the overall kind of mosaic, right, of growing up in a space confronted by love, joy, structural violence, trauma, pain, but also resilience, recovery. Just sort of how we kind of filter all of these things in our experience. So like the story is a lot of, it focuses a lot on kind of the son's grief about the loss of his mom, but there's also, that there's also moments of brilliance, there's also moments of joy, there's also moments of, I guess the main purpose of it is, not just to settle in that grief, but it is pointing toward a form of healing as a process, right? And how that looks. So I think capturing an almost surreal, supernatural experience of growing up in a working class neighborhood and public housing, capturing sort of that mosaic of like pain, but also joy and also giving, and also kind of how we negotiate the ways in which we survive or don't survive. If that makes sense.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. Since we're kind of going that route, I'd love to also ask you, I think specifically about the kind of supernatural, spiritual nature of the book, right? Like that's one of the things that is also really interesting. You have this conversation about life and death and memory and generational histories and this kind of sense of the supernatural. And it creates this kind of, it's part of what creates this kind of unsteady feel throughout the book. You're not quite sure if the thing you're reading that the speaker says is true is necessarily true, right? If that's really what's happening in front of their eyes. But it's a really interesting sense to like force the reader into. But I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about why that was so appealing to you. Right? You talked a little bit about kind of the myths that we tell each other or tell sort of like talk in our own communities about our elders or about so-and-so who like, we only know their first name, but they've been here for generations, you know what I mean? Like those folks, right? Like, but can you talk to me a little bit more about why that kind of tool fits so well with what you were trying to do in the book?
Yeah. Something Victor Lavelle mentioned in like this talk he gave at my school in Mississippi, and he was just basically saying write the monsters, write the ghosts, write all of these things, because at times that's how we can kind of show or write about the surrealness of what we go through on a day-to-day, if that makes sense. By kind of thinking about, like, our lives are very surreal. The way structural violence, the way racism, the way class works in our lives isn't a linear thing. It isn't an objective thing. It's very uncanny at times. It's very, you'll be standing in like a public assistance line and just like, or some sort of bureaucratic exchange, and you're like, this is how we're treated, or this is how our folk are treated. So to capture kind of like the strangeness or the the monstrous ways in which kind of like the structural damage that gets done to our communities, in order to kind of like write about that fully or richly or even imaginatively, is to insert these things. So that was like my main sort of, I guess, not inclination, but like my goal had to be like, all right, let me lean into this a bit more. And like, as I kept writing, like I just love the idea of imagining like a Yoruba priestess just like roaming around the hood, just like helping folk, and just like parsing. And many of these folk kind of who practice sort of spiritually, or like are mediums and stuff like that. They do exist in our communities. But I was just excited about kind of exploring how that would look and tracing that kind of colonial lineage, right? So you think about the Yoruba's approach to death, right? Death is not the end. And I found that extremely powerful, especially in a place that is essentially wants us dead, right? So thinking about a practice or a spiritual practice that didn't see death as an end, right? And tracing that from the Yoruba and the colonial process to where it becomes Santeria in Cuba or Vodou in Haiti and stuff. Following those and then just like playing those out in like very contemporary fashions, right? And maybe sort of investigating, I guess, how spiritual practice, works in our lives, like especially as we're trying to kind of like figure out or make a way or connect with each other against like a kind of westernized Christian idea of like what faith is. So yeah, I think that's why I was
Yeah, that was great. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. I'd love to. I feel like I might be able to name some of the people, but I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what kind of influences you pulled from for that aspect of the book. I feel like the idea of mythology and different kinds of mythologies as part of like narrative has been around for like ever, right? So you have a lot of things that you can pull from. But I think the particular things that you're doing with spirituality and this idea of like being able to make sense of kind of, it feels like what you're talking about and a lot of what you read about in the book are kind of the kind of absurdities, right, of like capitalism, white capitalism, all these sorts of things, the way that they disenfranchise people, the kind of ridiculous things people have to do to get their basic needs covered. What happens when like they spend a lifetime doing those things and still, like all those sorts of like over time those things build up, and the idea that like using myths or sort of blurring the line between realities or life and death as like a way to make sense of those things, or to like have some sort of a way to like comfort ourselves, or have like things that we can like lean on for strength at the same time, I think is really interesting. But I'm curious about what your references are for that.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think even initially, we think about magical realism. You got to do 100 Years of Solitude, or Juan Rulfo, who wrote Pedro Paramo, or Isabel Allende. It's sort of like taking these historical moments, these colonial moments in their home countries, and like putting on this layer of like magic or the supernatural or spirituality or whatever, and using that to kind of talk about the political, the social moment. I also think there's a bunch of Toni Morrison in this, from Sula, in terms of like thinking about Key, the main, one of the main characters, like just even thinking about, an autonomous woman, kind of like in a literary space done by a master. Like, what does that look like? Also think of Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed, who sort of plays with that Yoruba priestess kind of figure. There's a chapter in here called Legba, which is obviously a reference to Ishmael Reed and that kind of tradition of kind of voodoo figures and spiritual figures. It's a lot. Paul Marshall and kind of how she describes Brooklyn, her version of Brooklyn, and that kind of Caribbean, immigrant experience, that migration. This book, I feel like it's kind of a migratory book as well. Just rooted in kind of the Great Migration, right? The dimensionality of folk from the South moving to New York, to Pittsburgh, to St. Louis, to Chicago, and the kind of pocket dimensions that creates in these places where it's like, yeah, we're in New York, but like, you know, we keep our traditions, we keep our rituals. So, you know, a lot of times when I'm in New York, my family, you know, has a family reunion. Like a lot of our rituals, a lot of our food, a lot of our music is the same. So thinking about it also like it's Paul Marshall kind of migratory sense. Um, Also, I mean, there's a lot. There's a ton of kind of, I think, even the theory by Barbara T. Christian, kind of sort of radical pushback against typical or like mainstream forms of theory or knowledge or whatever. This definitely, you know, again, pushes back against, you know, I don't want to like make it more than more than it is, but it's not, I guess, the typical kind of representational model of Blackness that I see in literature all the time, where it's like, how does this character act in white spaces, and what does that mean for Blackness? What does that mean for all Black people? It's like, no, like all of these characters are Black and brown working class, and the book is very much concerned in, and I kind of love how you describe your book of poems. Like this is to Ferguson, not about this place. You know what I mean? So finding the how we work out our issues, or how we theorize, or bodily even, like how we embody some of these like critical concepts. And yeah, and like how that like is in that in itself is kind of criticizing or pushing back or rebelling against kind of these mainstream ideas about ourselves and like who we're supposed to be, and working out those definitions ourselves. And hopefully, I don't know, like hopefully, I think this book begins to ask some of those questions, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things that you do push back on, one of the kind of very common narratives that you push back on in a really interesting way in the book, is the idea of this sort of like first generation college student, like Black college student archetype, right? And because Kiese son Kali, right, is the first to go to college, but it's not this sort of like college as my gateway to the middle class kind of a narrative, right? You have this a kid who, because you know, I think as I was reading it, the thing that I was really struck by, especially as we were getting towards the end and getting to know more about Kali as he was growing up, and moving into the stage where he's going into college, and even hearing about the way that he talked about his surroundings, right, when he was in high school, but it's less of a outsider who doesn't feel like he belongs in this community kind of thing, and so he's observing and he's commenting on this community, right? He's very much shaped by it, very obviously, and affected by it. And you see that so clearly kind of throughout the book, but especially at the end when he's sort of like in college, comes back home, like you see this kind of, you don't get this kind of redemptive arc that I think that a lot of narratives about the first college student assume always exists in every first college student from a, like, you know, right, like you don't get that here. And it feels, and part of what that does is you end up with characters that feel very deeply grounded and kind of rooted in their experiences, and also continually shaped as we're reading by those experiences, as opposed to this kind of narrative voice that's like talking about, describing these people, this community that I came from, right? Like as like not this ambassador, but like very much still a part of that place. And I think I mean, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the book, about the narrative. I think I do want to kind of like pull again, or kind of circle back to this conversation about this colonial pathway that you're talking about in terms of faith and spirituality. And go ahead and talk about the research and the archival work that you did going into this book. I'd love if we could talk maybe first about the broader research that you did about the history, then we'll kind of zoom into like the familial archival work. That's cool.
For sure. And just going back to what you briefly touched on about how it ends, how Kali's story ends. Yeah, like I didn't want it to be like, oh, he's the magical, first generation college student, changes and like, he's redeemed. No, he's in the shits. He's looking out for drug dealers. He's like, fully embroiled in like the sort of like things that you might get up to in some of these neighborhoods. And like, I didn't want his quietness or his sort of like all these kind of qualities that like hint at a certain type of archetype. All this shit is luck. All this shit is circumstance. All this shit, that's one. And in terms of spirituality, the research, it was a lot. It was, starting with kind of Yoruba kind of spiritual practices and investigating sort of the Imanya and like the sort of figures associated with this, and then going sort of country by country. So Vodou and Santeria, and noticing the similarities between the figures, the gods, so to speak, the practices. So that thread was always there, and it was made clearer to me, just kind of seeing the process of how this happened. There's these are syncretic religions. So a lot of them take Santeria, for example, is a lot of this Yoruba tradition combined with Christianized kind of ideals. So just that alone is a colonial process within itself, right? And using that to kind of symbolize sort of, again, another migratory, because Brooklyn is mainly like, I didn't meet another like Southern Black person until I was like in high school. Like all my friends was from the Caribbean, or or from places in Africa. So my understanding of Blackness wasn't solely rooted in kind of the South or slavery, or slavery in America, in North America, but it was much more expansive. And then, so that was kind of my way of bringing that, like, those kind of colonial journeys into the book. And then also the archival work that went into kind of examining my own community, finding out the origins of some of the names of the street names, as a Black boy or a Black person walking this neighborhood, and you see slave owner names everywhere you go, or the names of like politicians, and just what that does to the body, or what that does to your mindset. There was this newspaper clipping in the Brooklyn Eagle from like 18th century, and it described, and the church is still here. It's this Dutch Reformed church on New Lots, and it has the cemetery next to it. And this old newspaper clipping, it talked about how the white folk would, inter their dead in the cemetery, and they might bury a couple slaves in the corner or whatever, and then the rest with no headstones. Then the rest, they just kind of, you had to figure it out. Like the Black folk just had to figure it out, and they bury each other kind of across the street. So now this, where they where they were buried is now the city has made it it's like African burial ground. Like they've changed the street name. It's like African Burial Ground Square or something like that. But doing this research and excavating that kind of like made me, like, oh, okay, like I never thought about like the processes or the rituals surrounding like burying our dead. And especially like think about, us centuries ago, but like just brought to this country, dragged to this country. We got to figure out like respectable, redeeming ways to bury and think about death. So that notion just kind of stuck with me, and I was just trying to figure out how to bring it into the present, or how to incorporate that part into the story. And I think that's why the book is so obsessed with death, but death that is not an end, because of that, because we walk on haunted land, and also just as a young Black man growing up in a poor neighborhood, how many people I know who have been, killed. I think it was a way to kind of negotiate that with myself, right? Or my experience of bringing past deaths, present deaths, and future deaths, and kind of this liminal kind of place, right? And try to write, I don't know, try to figure some way, some connection, some way that they all link. And yeah, that's it.
Okay. Want to open it up for Q&A?
Yeah, I think we're gonna open it for Q&A. I have so many more questions, by the way, but it's okay. Anyone in the audience who has questions?
Okay, I don't know if I have a question, but a comment. Like, I got up to buy it. I got up to like pick up the book because I think I was really interested in your approach to like, describing your neighborhood and how you grew up. As I was thinking about all of the stories that I've read, like, or even like my stereotypical experience of New York, like I saw Times Square, like, ooh, that's New York. And, but this idea that you take this expansive approach to the parts that we don't talk about, I'm really digging that. And then with the whole magical realism, I'm looking forward to it because it just sounds like a really fresh approach to like the types of stories that you normally hear about Black people. And I'm absolutely here for it.
Thank you. That's and that's why I wrote it, because again, I ran into that. I ran into trying to tell my story and being like, what makes this any different from any other stories? Like, what sets it apart? And I'm like, these are, these people, like, we deserve to have stories written about us. You know what I mean? And trying to find, I guess, just new ways, interesting ways to kind of do it without like veering too far from the truth or the honesty that I want to convey, but also that I feel like we convey to each other. So like, there's no like family secrets. Like even in the book, I grapple with like a certain stories told to me. Like, is it my job to even put them kind of out there? You know what I mean? Like, because this story is so contingent on that folklore, that myth making that we do. And it's hard. It's hard to like, I guess, put our business on the streets.
Yeah.
But also be upfront and be genuine kind of with like what happened to us, or like what in terms of like working class people in these communities, in these neighborhoods. And that it's not like endemic, or it's not like pathological, right? But it's just like a result of the conditions in which we were given, you know? And I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah. And the other part, the other thing that I noticed, which was maybe tangentially related, but when you said write the monster, I was like, oh my God, yeah. Because we got like, you know, we got our personal monsters, we got those hood legend monsters, we got family secret monsters, and I'm like, that right there, that little moment, that was like hella inspirational. So like, yeah, I definitely, if I don't take anything away from like this moment, right, the monsters is gonna be it.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one, really. Any other questions?
Sorry if y'all talked about this when I stepped out. I'll talk louder. Okay? If you might have mentioned this when I had to step out, but when I started, I just got kind of embarrassed. But when I started reading, it felt like I was reading poetry, and it was just incredibly lyrical, and it didn't seem like it was intentional, which I found even better about it. It just seemed like you were so in love with your surroundings and your world, and there was like, it was written from this perspective of like, as you were saying, like, I'm steeped in this is my place, my community, my people, and it showed up really well in the writing. And so I'm just curious if you actually like write poetry and what other kinds of writing you like to do and are interested in, and maybe that you read or tinker with on the side.
Yeah, all my friends are poets, right? So I grew up writing like lyrics, like most kind of did, right?
Which is poetry.
Right, exactly. So I grew up writing bars. In New York, they got urban word. So my homie started bringing me, and through that, like a lot of like my early writer friends were you know, poets. So I kind of, and I thought I was a poet at one point. So in college, I thought I was poeting. But you know, I always wrote stories, right? Whether, you know, just playing around in school or like, you know, like the AOL chat rooms, remember? Yeah. But yeah, just like writing stories or thinking in narrative form. And I think I was just lucky enough to surround myself with poets instead of fiction writers early in my writing days. And that's no shade, but there's a lot of shade. And but yeah, just kind of that love of language, you know what I'm saying? Like fiction writers just, you know, it's all about plot, it's all about story, it's all about pushing forward. Poetry, it shrinks a moment or it extends a moment forever. And you know, that's incredible. And that kind of attention and that love for language was really, you know, it's why I love Morrison, it's why I love Jesmyn Ward, it's why I love the greatest, right? You know what I mean? Like, because of what they do on a craft, on a sentence level. So yeah, that was like my main kind of, and plus the place I was writing about, you know, I wanted to love on it deeply, you know, I wanted to care for it deeply, even though it might have hurt me at one point, right? I still love it deeply, and I still go back all the time, you know what I mean? Like, you know, my mom is still in the vicinity, not particularly in that neighborhood, but you know, so I would hope that my love or my care for the place kind of came through, you know.
Any more questions? If not, we can do book sales and book signings.
Okay, one more question. Okay, so, and I think I'm just thinking about, you know, my area, my hood, and my experience in St. Louis. How do you think that your book counteracts gentrification?
That's a good question. I think what happens in the end of the book kind of counteracts because, like you were alluding to, you know, you have the college grad who like first in his generation, first in his family. He doesn't, you know, move to Wall Street and get some like new job or something like that. He goes back to his neighborhood because of decisions, because of that relationship he had with his mom. His mom was deeply invested in giving back to her community and helping the people on a day-to-day basis. And his dad, who is present and is also grieving the loss of his mom, he's a bit more detached. He's there, but just emotionally, he's having trouble processing the death of his wife. So that causes him to be a bit more detached and inward, right? And his perspective on the neighborhood is different. Like he was a hustler. So it's just a different dynamic. And I think Kali chooses his mom's path of being rich in community and being not alone and being, you know, and choosing a path that leads back home in a sense, you know? And yeah, I think he uses that to kind of like, not just go back, but, you know, he's almost haunted by it, innocent. I mean, and that's kind of where you get the title. But like, in a sense, he's haunted by just the space, you know, geographically, but also what it meant to his mom. So it becomes like it's twofold of why he comes back. And I think that kind of pushes back against gentrification because it supports us returning to where we're from and like thinking about our impact and how we could, you know, just be in community with where we're from, you know, and just figure out what that looks like, you know. We don't gotta help, we don't gotta, I mean, we should, but thinking deeply about the ways in which that help looks, so it takes, you know what I'm saying? Because people will go back and like, oh, I want to help, and I want to do this and stuff like that, and it's not. So, yeah.
I'll also answer. Sorry. Since I'm like, I'm gonna also answer because I thought one of the things that I think is really valuable about this book that I think sometimes people forget about gentrification, but there's a way that people kind of individualize poverty and have this narrative about gentrification, fixing or correcting XYZ neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. But the vast majority of the issues, the frustrations, the disempowerment, the inequality that happens that's on display in this book is all red tape, bureaucratic, structural stuff, right? The number of times in this book that characters are trying to get their houses fixed or calling for repairs or like all of the lost their job because all these different things that are sort of like the way that we talk about poverty with these like individualized evils as opposed to broad structural failings of a community, and the idea that like in the event of gentrification that you then have people not just pushing out communities but like suddenly can fix things, right? And so the question of like who's failing who and like I think that comes through in the book in a way that clarifies why gentrification or this like processes of how we talk about neighborhoods, why they're so bankrupt, because like the actual interiority of what it means to live in those places and maintain and be stuck in those places and to like maintain and build a family and a life there is clarified in this book in a way that I think a lot of conversations about gentrification miss. So your book is so good. Any other questions?
Well, if not, we can call it, do some signing. Is that all right?
Cool.
Yeah.
Appreciate y'all for pulling up.
Yeah, it's so good.